Salutations, fellow citizens. My name is Tom, and this is Get Nuanced with TJC. In this particular segment for y'all today, I have quite a jam-packed episode here on a subject that has been discussed quite a number of times, but as of recently at least, on top of the fact that I have been on a hiatus, brief side note, I will have a standalone update segment coming for you all soon, both on the channel as well as on the podcast page, where I will, clarify a few things, but I wanted to dive deep into a topic here that in the past I've touched on and has been at least recently relegated to the back burner of political affairs, especially when you're concerning things in the broader scope, especially if you think about it, when it comes to international relations and geopolitics. These are things that don't just happen, at least when it comes to the particular events in discussion, in a vacuum. They're all interconnected. However, sometimes there are particular theaters that flare up and take the attention from those both amateur and professional observers alike and tend to, grab, I guess in lack of a better term, more eyeballs. I mean, not to diminish or pick and choose when it comes to the plights of ordinary people that these sorts of conflicts and, situations involve. Oftentimes, the headlines tend to distill and filter out certain things in preference of others and vice versa, depending on those who are concerned and the varying priorities of the various players and, overall when it comes to the world. When those who are seeing it from the outside, such as ourselves, at least in my case, when it comes to what is going to be affecting not just those particular places in discussion, but also the other intricacies that tend to, have a more downstream effect, such as when it comes to the recently concluded U.S. presidential election. At least if you're listening to this, I am recording this on December 2024, and I could talk about that. I'll talk about domestic politics in another segment, and maybe I'll touch upon it in a little bit, because this is, as I mentioned before, a jam-packed segment. However, in this particular podcast here, and I'll have the video and audio version available for those concerned, just in case if you want to check out either. When it comes to this, though, I want to stick mostly to foreign policy here, not just pertaining to the United States, because America has been involved in the Syrian civil war from the onset, as well as a multitude of other factions and players that I'm going to get into. I want to start this off by getting into an article here from the New York Times. I'll link it in the description below because I think it is a good launching off point, and then I'll get further into the nitty-gritty and then provide, of course, my own analysis. So I'm not just, summarizing what you could find somewhere else, but providing my particular intuition, take it for what it's worth, on what is going on and what I believe is to come. And I do guarantee that, unlike in the past, as I'll clarify in my update segment, I am going to have a plethora of content coming down the pipeline, not just on this particular topic, but on others interrelated that I will briefly touch upon here and deserve their own particular dedicated segment. But without further ado, let's get into this article here, and I'll link it below, but it's titled, and it's from the New York Times, "Syria's Rebels Struck When Assad's Allies Were Weakened and Distracted." And of course, if you couldn't tell by the title of this particular segment, yes, I'm going to be doing a dive into the Syrian civil war, which ever since 2011 has really been one of the main conflagrations in the Middle East, and at least as of the last few years has been largely on the back burner when it comes to the broader sort of arena of international relations, but now has been, as of the last couple of days, I'm recording this on December 1st, 2024, this has now been thrust back into the international headlines for better and for worse due to the ongoing developments there, which are nothing short of extraordinary. And I'm going to get into those now in this article and then provide you all with my take afterwards. The subtext, or the subtitle, is "Diminished support for the Syrian government from Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia enabled opposition forces to take the initiative and seize new territory." And this article is by Raja Abdulran. I'm not butchering that. Apologies in advance if I am. And by any chance this author is tuning in, or somebody of, Arabic extraction, my bad in advance. I am an English speaker based in America, so, forgive me for that. But without further ado, let's dive in. For years, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria was able to beat back opposition fighters with the help of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. Now, with those allies weakened or distracted by their own conflict, rebels have seized the opportunity to shift the balance of power. The rebel fighters spent months training and preparing for a surprise offensive, but even they may not have predicted how quickly they would advance. On Saturday, the rebels said they had captured almost all of Aleppo, one of Syria's biggest cities, and they now control a broad stretch of land in the west and northwest of the country, according to the rebels and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a British-based war monitor. The timing of the assault and its success, analysts say, reveal the vulnerabilities of Mr. al-Assad's once formidable coalition. The Syrian civil war started 13 years ago when peaceful anti-government protesters were met with brutal crackdowns, escalating into a conflict between forces loyal to Mr. al-Assad and rebels. Over time, the combatants drew support and foreign fighters from regional and international powers. Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia all sent help to the Syrian military. Hezbollah and Iranian-backed fighters battled alongside Syrian forces. Russia and Iran sent military advisors, and Russia carried out intense airstrikes on rebel-held territory. But today, Iran has been weakened by Israeli airstrikes, battlefield losses by its proxy forces, the so-called axis of resistance, and an economic crisis at home. Hezbollah, one of those proxy forces, has been battered and diminished after 13 months of war with Israel and the killing of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah. And Russia is now nearing the end of its third year of a war of attrition with Ukraine. Quote, he was able to survive the civil war because of all the assistance he got, and that's gone, end quote. Joshua Landis, head of the Middle East Studies program at the University of Oklahoma, said of Mr. al-Assad, quote, Israel has changed the balance of power in the region by going on this all-out war on the axis of resistance, end quote. Quote, now Assad is all alone, end quote, he said. His position was weakened even further by an apparent shift by Turkey, which is allied with many of the rebel groups and had opposed an offensive against the Syrian government. And brief side note, this is just for me personally. They officially refer to themselves now as Turkey. But that aside, since the Hamas-led attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, Israel has increasingly carried out airstrikes on Hezbollah, which began hitting it with rockets in support of Hamas and Iranian fighters and infrastructure inside Syria. Hezbollah and Iranian forces either went into hiding or withdrew from Syria to fight elsewhere, said Hay'at Tahrir, a senior consulting associate fellow at Chatham House, a London-based research institute. Russia has played perhaps the most crucial role in aiding Mr. al-Assad. Though it is still assisting his government with some airstrikes, it is entrenched in its own war in Ukraine and has pulled much of its military focus away from Syria. Even with Hezbollah and Iran by its side since the early days of the civil war, the Syrian government still lost its grip on large swaths of territory until Russia directly intervened in 2015. Alongside Syrian warplanes and military helicopters, Russian airstrikes helped turn the tide of the war in Mr. al-Assad's favor. Syria's military historically struggled at urban warfare, but during the intense years of the civil war, its own air power and Russia's allowed Mr. al-Assad to bomb the opposition into submission. This time, though, quote, the regime was so much weaker than anyone thought, and Russia was almost nowhere to be seen, end quote, said Dareen Khalifa, a senior advisor at the International Crisis Group. Since Wednesday, Russia has carried out some airstrikes against the rebels and on opposition-held towns and cities, but they were not overwhelming, according to Mr. Hayes. Quote, we have not seen the same level of support and intensity of airstrikes that we saw previously, end quote, he said. In the wake of the assault on Aleppo, Moscow fired its top general in Syria, Sergei Kisel, according to two military bloggers, Rebar and military informant, who have ties to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Within 4 days of the rebels having drastically changed the front lines of the Syrian conflict, which had remained static for more than 4 years, and it was events beyond Syria's border that really had set the stage. Last week, Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire deal with Israel. The group leading the offensive against the Syrian government, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, a former al-Qaeda affiliate, may have decided that time was of the essence, Mr. Haid and other analysts have said. Quote, one of the things that may have pushed them to start when they did was the fear that Hezbollah might resend its fighters that withdrew from those front lines, end quote, Mr. Haid said. But conditions on the ground in Syria also created the crucial conditions for a successful rebel offensive. Even with his allies embroiled in other conflicts, Mr. al-Assad seemed confident that his own front lines were not at risk. His government had withdrawn some of its forces there, while soldiers continued to staff checkpoints in government-held territory, often shaking Syrians down for bribes, according to multiple analysts. Mr. al-Assad had also failed to produce any economic improvement, which many Syrians had expected once the government recaptured large parts of the country in recent years. He also failed to unify the country or regain support from a population alienated by years of civil war and the unrelenting violence and terror carried out by the government. The government also continued to forcibly conscript young men into the military, soldiers who, when faced with a rapidly advancing and organized rebel offensive last week, chose to flee rather than fight. Leaders of the Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham opposition group said that they were watching the geopolitical shifts around them, especially the weakening of the axis of resistance by Israel and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and assessing how they could exploit these changes. Ms. Khalifa said, quote, at the same time, quote, she said, quote, they had been building up their military capability over the last year and had been signaling this military offensive over the last 2 months, end quote. There were other factors for the rebels to consider as well. Until recently, Turkey, which backs some of the rebel factions involved in the offensive, but has a more complicated relationship with Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham. It was opposed to the offensive against the Syrian government initially, Ms. Khalifa said. Turkey also hosts more Syrian refugees than any other country, over 3 million, or according to government figures, and officials have long worried that any new violence near their southern border could set off a new wave of refugees. But last week's offensive signals that Turkish officials may have changed their position, Ms. Khalifa said. Quote, all of these things combined have made it an opportune time, end quote, she said. And that is the end of the article. It'll be linked in the description below. If you're among those who'd fancy giving it a gander yourself, don't just take my word for anything, as I always tell you all. Make sure to check out the description. I'll have that as well as other resources for reference purposes linked over there. But without further ado now, beyond my analysis, which I'm about to dive into, I want to bring you all up to speed, since I did mention, I'll include them also in the description below, my past discussions on this topic, because listen, at the end of the day, each one I do, as I've mentioned before, on a topic as complicated as this ongoing Syrian crisis and conflict, no one particular video segment or podcast is going to be able to fully cover the breadth and width of everything that this type of thing entails. Beyond the fact that there's information that's only privy to intelligence agencies, the governments, and various factions that are involved on the ground, etc., etc. There's also just the reality that even without those types of things, you know, those variables in the mix, there's just, in terms of time and the fact that we're living increasingly in a 24/7 news cycle where, as I'm speaking, events could be further taking shape and making some of what I'm talking about right now a bit irrelevant, but nonetheless, for the sake of education and journalism, as well as just being able to highlight topics here on this podcast, like everybody else who does a similar type of thing does, I want to be able to get into these and give my take, as well as encourage those such as yourselves tuning in to do your own research and to keep up with this, because as I mentioned before, no man is an island unto themselves. And just because you might think, well, this event's going on all the way over there in the Middle East, what does that have to do with me here, if you're someone like myself in America or in the West or any other place across the world that isn't in this particular area of the world? Just because you're not in the crosshairs of this conflict doesn't mean that there's going to be reverberating impacts that will have effects on yourself and those among you who, you know, you care about, such as your friends and family. And that depends, and your mileage will vary depending on where you are in the world. Some places it's going to hit harder than others, for sure, and some in ways they're more direct than others as well. But, you know, this could be said about any potential conflict of this sort of scope, where there's so many players that it's not just, you know, I mean, some have called it the Syrian Civil War, but the reality is it has long since taken on an international character, in the sense that you have the great powers of the day, whether you're talking about America, you know, my home country here, which is the, you know, contemporary superpower, as well as the other great powers vying for their own slice of supremacy in whether it be there near abroad or trying to, unseat America and create a more sort of multipolar arrangement when it comes to international affairs, such as China, Russia, Iran. In particular, Russia and Iran are directly, there are, instances of China, North Korea, etc., having relations with Syria. I mentioned in a previous podcast how Assad had actually visited the Asian Games hosted in China and had met with Xi a bit ago. I'm sure it was a happier time for him, on a side note. When it comes to Russia and Iran, as I recently had just mentioned in the article that I had narrated from the New York Times, they are, quite frankly, two of the most invested players on top of America, and also I'm going to get into it when it comes to Turkey and the Gulf states, who also have a significant stake in what's going on here, and Israel as well. Israel, the situation ever since October 7th, which I'll get into in a little bit, and I have an update when it comes to covering that topic, because I wanted to create a standalone update, because I had originally covered a brief sort of synopsis of what was going on October 7th of 2023, but as you all can tell by the calendar, a lot has happened in the last year, and I'll, clarify my hiatus why I had not been able to, because trust me, I wish I had the time to be able to dive into this and talk about all these things all day. Maybe I will in the future, but right now I have other personal obligations, some I'll get into in another segment. But when it comes to the situation there, like I mentioned, it actually had a significant contribution to the Syrian situation right now, where you have these rebel forces, mainly backed by Turkey. You have, and I'm going to get into, I think this is a good point to where I'll dive into the various factions. And actually, I'll just very quickly, because I linked below, and I've already discussed the origins of this conflict, but to bring you all up to speed very quickly before I get into the various names and faces, because it's a lot to digest, trust me. But when it comes to this situation here, you had a drought and water crisis in the Middle East. It had been a long-standing issue that is part of the reverberating impacts of the global climate change sort of, dynamic that has been happening. And we could debate the level of which human contribution, anthropological contributions are exacerbating it, whether it's too late or not too late, etc., etc. And I'm somebody who still thinks we should still try to proactively mitigate that type of thing, and it's a global issue that's not just restricted to Syria or the Middle East. That'll be a topic in and of itself that I'll have to revisit, but that was something that had contributed to the tensions that were going on in the sort of civic society of Syria, which had in the 2000s, prior to 2011, been in a transition phase in and out its own, as you had the second son, actually, because originally you had, ever since the 1960s, ever since the coup, a certain Hafiz al-Assad who had presided over Syria and had a personalist dictatorship cult of personality in order to consolidate power. He ruled by military fiat, and the sort of, he was an intelligent guy, just divorcing morality out of it, but he had ruled and set up his family as part of this broader Alawite minority, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. They're about 11% of the Syrian population as a whole. Keep in mind, Syria has existed as a geographical unit for over a millennia, but the modern nation state of Syria had only come into being post-World War I with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the French Mandate and the, intervention of the victorious Allied powers who had sought to carve up the Central Powers. It also was in Eastern Europe when it came to the former dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary as well as Imperial Germany, but in particular with the Ottoman Empire, which had aligned itself with the Central Powers and had been part of the losing side in World War I. You had the Middle East now that was sort of up for grabs. The Arabs actually had collaborated with the British. I've read the Sheikh of Mecca, actually, he was part of the Hashemite royal family that still rules Jordan to this day. He and his people had agreed under the understanding that after the First World War, if they were to assist in overthrowing the Turkish yoke, that they would be able to create their own sort of pan-Arabic state, and it would be able to be independent. Long story short, there was a lot of complications. Lawrence of Arabia is actually a very interesting story in particular and figure that just mentioning, because there's a whole dynamic there that we could get into. But to keep a long story short, and I'm sure I'll revisit in the future, you had, after World War I, these colonial sort of mandates that the French French and British had carved out of the Ottoman Empire. And the Turkish Republic, under a certain Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, would be able to prevent the further hemorrhaging of the former empire and consolidate itself into an independent successor state known as the Republic of Turkey, which is a major player in today's situation under Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the Turks were able to prevent their heartland in Anatolia, or formerly Asia Minor, as the Greeks would call it, and this area that was dominated by the Turks post-World War I would be retained, as well as with Edirne and Istanbul, or what was formerly Constantinople, the part of the European area of Turkey. However, this area, which was also part of the Ottoman Empire and what was the Imperial Turkey, had been carved away. And in particular, you would have Syria, which, it's interestingly enough, Hatay, where there was an earthquake a little bit ago. Rest in peace, and my heart goes out to those. I mean, with Antioch being the historic city there that had taken a hit and is known, famously as one of the founding Christian holy cities and part of the Christian origin story as it came out of the Middle East. That area was historically part of what is Syria as a broader, sort of idea or concept, but was carved into part of Turkey. And I mean, there's a dispute, I think, still between Syria and Turkey, among other disputes, when it comes to whether that should have been part of the, newly founded independent Syria after the French had left. And in this situation, because the French also had an influence in Lebanon as well, which was carved out, not to mention all the other intricacies with the British and the Mandate of Palestine, which is its own topic, not to get too deep into things again. This is a very complicated subject, and I'll definitely get back into that stuff in a bit. Syria, as a modern nation state, if you look at it on a map, and I'll link below the Live UA map, which I've been using for reference purposes, it is a multi-ethnic state that was sort of arbitrarily drawn around lines following the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where it was less about domestic tranquility of the locals and more about carving out a sort of arrangement geographically that would be the most conducive to the political interest and prerogatives of the French and the British at the time, just to put it bluntly, just looking at it from a raw power dynamic perspective. And as a consequence, along with Iraq and the other areas of Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, etc., you have in Syria a patchwork of different ethno-religious groups, from the Aramaic speakers, you have the Greek Orthodox Melkites, you have obviously there were Jews there before the founding of Israel and their migration. You also have Sunni and Shia Arabs, the Alawite minority, which is the contingent that the ruling Assad family hails from. They're about 11% of the population, and they're mainly from, I mean, there's other areas that they are residing throughout, but as a minority, they primarily are centered around Latakia, Tartus, and that sort of area of Syria on the coast, in the more mountainous area. But when it comes to that particular group, it's important because they actually got their sort of influence during the French Mandate period, when the French had carved out within their own mandate different states around ethno-religious lines, and the Alawites were one of those. And the Alawites in particular are important because Hafiz al-Assad, who had taken control of Syria, coming full circle, is an Alawite of Alawite extraction himself. And then following his demise or death from a heart attack in the year 2000, his second son, actually, because originally his oldest son, Bassel al-Assad, who I think his nickname was the Golden Knight, he was being groomed and was the heir apparent. Sort of similar, actually, and I should talk about this in another segment, I've been meaning to. Just like with Kim Jong-nam, who was supposed to be Kim Jong-il's heir and eldest son, it ended up being a second son who would end up gaining having fortune or misfortune, depending on how you look at rulership, being thrust upon them. Just as in the case of Kim Jong-un, Bashar al-Assad, the second son, was the only sort of a backup that initially he was going to school and at the time was aspiring to be an optometrist, an eye doctor, ironically, because I don't think he was someone, like a lot of eye doctors who I've spoken with, who are not fond of dealing with blood. And that's actually where he, I think, would meet his future wife, Asma al-Assad, who would then accompany with him to Syria following his abrupt rise to power, due to the fact that Bassel al-Assad, who was studying in Germany at the time, I think there was a freak car accident, and he died, I think, speeding on a foggy day in Berlin, in a car crash. This is why you should always wear your seatbelt. And that had led to there having to be a sort of hasty arrangement made to groom Bashar, who would have to be the heir and replacement for Basil, because shortly after, Hafez had died, maybe due to, I mean, I'm sure he was already on his way out, but the increased stress probably of his eldest son passing probably only exacerbated things. But, you know, following 2000, with the Bashar al-Assad coming to power, he was seen by the West as a potential reformer, and he, of course, was an international student with a background in the West, in Britain in particular, hence why he's fluent in English. I've seen several interviews of his where it's very clear he has a background being quite fluent in English among other languages, which allows him to, you know, very effectively craft propaganda and also navigate the sort of Western media ecosystem. Now, I'm not mistaken, I remember watching a segment way back when where he, I think, had admitted he even watches the Young Turks among other Western-oriented channels, for better and for worse. But Bashar al-Assad aside, as he is an interesting figure, he has been the ruler of Syria, and due to different circumstances, the reforming, you know, sort of maybe mentality that it looks like he might have been, like, just like with Putin perhaps, more inclined towards initially, he had to dial that back, especially with the drought and the tensions, because as I mentioned before, Syria is a patchwork of different peoples, and the Alawites only constitute, despite their predominance in controlling the security, the military, you know, the main economic business sectors. I know that Assad had issues back when my last segment I mentioned it with his cousin, or I think in-law, Rami Makhlouf, who was somebody that had significant control and was an oligarch in the telecoms business in Syria. Not to get, you know, sidetracked again, but just to give you an idea of how much of a grip this minority has on the broader sort of, you know, leverage of power in Syrian society. Despite the fact that they're an Alawite, you know, Shia offshoot, and some even among the Alawites, or some among the Shia and the Sunnis, and even the Alawites themselves, don't even agree with, in terms of the orthodox nature of the Alawites when it comes to their relationship with Islam, to put it in a way that's sort of, you know, succinct, I guess. But, and that's up for other people to decide. I'm not a Muslim myself, and I'm not going to debate that type of stuff. I mean, I think perspectives are good to keep into account, and there's merit depending on your point of view when it comes to, depending on who you are in the situation, your take on this matter. But anyways, the population, though, as I mentioned before, was also predominantly 60% though Sunni Islam and Sunni Arab, and not to mention that there is a significant chunk of territory that also has Kurds and other peoples that I mentioned before. This had led to a sort of dissatisfaction because of the fact that you have this sort of power dynamic where proportionally 11% of the country had power over, I mean, most of the things that actually mattered at the expense of the broader populace. And this drought and the water shortage, as well as the inequalities that had sort of been long brewing. I mean, Hafez had been famous in the 1980s. He gained the moniker. I mean, Assad in Arabic actually means lion. So in English, he'd be called the Lion of Damascus. But he was also infamously known as the Butcher of Hama, which is a city that's in the headlines at the moment and is potentially going to be the upcoming site of a siege where the rebels are going to face off against the Syrian government. But the reason why was because Hafez had brutally put down a revolt against him and that challenged his rule at the time, sort of mirroring what's going on today, but with Bashar, and the circumstances are a little bit different, but he had, you know, with his security forces, eliminated 200,000 of his own citizens in 1984, and that city in particular, among others. But when it comes to his role in the putting down of various revolts, because again, he was a military dictator, personality cult and everything aside, there was already been a history in Syria since the Assad family had taken power, even before Bashar, of popular discontent. But following the drought and then the Arab Spring, which had swept across the Middle East and North Africa, broadly speaking, this was something that had led from a, you know, sort of situation where there was simmering discontent to an all-out escalation that I'll get into now, because I want to make sure I get into the other things that are more up to speed with what's going on right now. And I'll have timestamps, I think, to make sure if you want to not, I mean, if you're familiar with this topic like I am here, because I'm speaking off the cuff, you might want to skip ahead to the major recent battle in Aleppo that is capturing the headlines. But just to bring you all up to speed very quickly, because again, I think that this context is important, because you don't want to just be firing in the dark here, metaphorically speaking, and there's a lot to keep in mind here. But the Arab Spring was this sort of uprising across the Middle East. It was, at least, I mean, because there was obviously mostly foreign influence due to the fact that other countries such as the US, Turkey, the Gulf states, they might have had a stake at varying levels depending on who you're talking to in changing the balance of power in the region. Historically, as I mentioned with Hafez al-Assad, he had long had a relationship with the former Soviet Union and then Russia, and that has been something that carried over, and I'll get into in a little bit. As the article mentioned in the Times, is important because that was a major lifeline, and the intervention of Russia was pretty decisive. Not to mention, I'll get into with Iran as well, which is something that has been affecting the dynamics right now. Long story short, with the Arab Spring, which had saw the toppling across the region of various leaders, you had elections in Tunisia, but then you also had not so peaceful uprisings that led to the ousting. Keep in mind, there was also, and I'm paraphrasing and summarizing this, there's more to it all, but just for the sake of brevity, you had the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 in Libya. I talked about that in a previous segment, where there's still fallout going on from that. You had the ousting of Hosni Mubarak, who ever since the assassination of Anwar Sadat had been presiding over Egypt for decades as a military dictator in and out himself, and then the rise of various players throughout the region in their place. Particular case of Syria, where Assad, many international observers, especially from the West, such as journalists and even those like Obama and Erdogan, were convinced that Assad's days were numbered all the way back in 2011. You saw what was initially peaceful protests that had escalated due to the crackdown and chaos. And keep in mind, it's a little bit complicated, and there's a lot of, blame and follies on all sides concerned. I mean, politics is a very messy game at the end of the day. Keep things short, and we can get back into some of these in the future. Maybe I'll do some live streams. You guys can all, and gals can all, ask me particular questions, and I can get into more of the nuances. By the time I'm done, if I keep going this deep into things, you will be over 3 hours into this, and I want to make sure I get to the situation in Aleppo. Long story short, the uprising happened. You had opposition groups forming throughout the country. Particularly in the northwest of Syria, you have the YPG, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are predominantly Kurdish, not all, but mostly, which the US has been backing as an alternative to both ISIS, which rose during the 2015-2016 period, 2014 to 2016 period, as due to the power vacuum left after Iraq and the fall of Mosul happened. All these things are connected with the US's intervention in the Middle East following 2001, 9/11, the war on terror, etc., etc. And not to try to gloss over these things so carelessly, but just to get you guys a quick sort of synopsis here. When it comes to the Syrian Democratic Forces over on the northwest, then you have the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. It's not the Syrian government itself, the Syrian Arab Republic, but you have a Turkish-backed contingent of troops, and as well in the northern part of Syria. I mean the Kurds in the northeast, and then the Turks, my bad, are the northwest, which are centered around Idlib, which had been up until this recent offensive a holdout area. For a period, it seemed like the Assad government was on its way out. You had the initial violent uprising came out of Dara in the southern area, close to the disputed area that has been occupied since the 1967 war with Israel, the Golan Heights, not too far away from that. You had that, and then at one point, Assad had lost control of most of the strategic population centers. You had Raqqa, the former capital of the Abbasid Caliphate under Harun al-Rashid. Then it became the capital of ISIS when it had its sort of caliphate period. You had that being lost. You had Homs, Aleppo, which we're going to get into. Hama. Homs, fun fact, is actually the hometown of the biological father of Steve Jobs, but just a random fact as someone who's a techie. But when it comes to that situation, Assad looked like, especially in 2014 when ISIS began to rise and start looking like it might even take Damascus, Assad seemed like he was on the brink. This is why, as I've mentioned in other segments, it's always good to have allies, friends in high places. And that relationship I mentioned that Hafez had cultivated with the former USSR and had been retained as the successor state of the USSR, the primary one, the Russian Federation, under Yeltsin and then later Putin. There was a period after the fall of the Soviet Union where it was a little bit more like lax, same with North Korea, but especially as of recent with North Korea, and then the same with now with Syria. The old ties had definitely had a heavy impact on the outcome of what was to come, as Putin had decided to throw down the gauntlet in 2015-2016 and had decided to directly intervene on behalf of the Syrian government to help Assad be able to regain control of the country. And although that was never fully completed up until right now in December of 2024, up until very recently with this recent campaign, Assad was able to, with the help of Russian air power and military contingents such as the Wagner Group, as well as a fair share of assistance from Iran and their network of Shia militias such as Hezbollah, and as well as the other groups such as the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, they were able to come together as a coalition, and by the end of all of it, after years of having to fight, I mean, this took 4 years, I believe, for Aleppo to be, which was, I mean, before this whole conflict. Keep in mind, Aleppo was called the Paris of the Orient at one point, or the Middle East, similar in a way where Saigon is called the Paris of, I guess, Southeast Asia. Aleppo itself was the largest city in terms of economic, cultural, and political influence in Syria up until the conflict. I think it's now, due to the depopulation and destruction that unfortunately was wrought during the war, Damascus has, for more than one reason, become, as beyond being the capital, now the largest populated and most economically important city. It was always the political center, but Aleppo was one of the main cities, going back to the days of the Ottomans, a very wealthy and very strategically important city as well, occupying the northwestern part of Syria. For years, though, it had been bombed by the Assad government to retake it from the rebels, and that seemed like, you know, at least up until recently, it was a successful operation. And for sure, Russia under Putin, and as well as Khamenei in Iran, they had made all the difference to ensure that Assad's government wasn't toppled. And then between them and then the US backing the YPG, as ISIS was beaten back, etc., etc. We can get into all of that stuff again in another segment, but long story short, getting to this point, and I guess as short as possible, we were at this point now in 2024 up until a few days ago where you sort of had a frozen conflict basically as the state of play, where Assad had basically regained control of all of the major population centers. He always controlled Damascus. I mean, at one point it looked like he might have lost it, but you have Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, Takya, Tartus. These are the population centers where the majority of the Syrian people live. Keep in mind, there has been a lot of internal displacements. During the Syrian conflict, you have over 500,000 people killed, and then you have millions of internally and externally displaced refugees. And the refugee crisis from Syria had also been one of the major reasons for the Brexit, and as well as the sort of more populist, right-wing populist political trends in Western Europe, and was sort of a harbinger also of the rise of Trump and everything. I mean, we can get into all that in another segment again, but it just shows you how interconnected and how important these events are, as well as the fact that a lot of refugees also had fled and are still displaced, over 1 million, I think, in Turkey as well, or millions. I'd have to double check how many refugees. I'm gonna check that. Refugees from Syria in Turkey. And that's, I think, one of the motivating factors for this, which I'll get into in a moment. Yeah, 3.6 million people, which is quite a lot, actually. Syria has been, to be pretty blunt, they've been going through hell. With all that going on, you had that frozen conflict sort of situation. If you look at Livey Map, which I'll link below, you had a sort of status quo where Assad controlled all of the population centers. You had this Al-Tanf air base with the Free Syrian Army, where the U.S. had controlled with oil area, as well with the YPG in the northeast. You had the U.S. presence there, as well as with the YPG, the Kurds, which makes this relationship complicated, was even though the Americans, or I guess in my case, I mean, because I'm an American here, even though we were allied with the Kurds because they were a more secular, or at least not Islamic jihadist sort of contingent that was also anti-Assad, anti-ISIS. The problem with that was the Turks, which I'm going to get into now in a little bit, they have a bone to pick with the Kurds due to the fact that the YPG has some tangential links. The PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has been is designated by the US and in Turkey as a terrorist organization, and has aspirations in Turkey of carving out part of the eastern part of Turkey and creating a sort of separate Kurdistan due to the fact that the Kurds, they're an ethno-religious group that, I mean, I think Saladin himself was a Kurd from, you know, the Crusades, you know, Saladin versus Richard the Lionheart, which just goes to show you how far back it goes. However, the Kurds had never had their own sort of independent state, and they have aspirations for one. There's a decent chunk of Kurds, population-wise, at the border areas between Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And in particular, now you have in Syria, due to the ongoing chaos, the Kurds were able to, with the assistance of the US, carve out their own sort of area of influence in the northeastern area. And that is something that looks like is going to be an important factor to keep in mind and look into as we proceed here. And we have these pockets of ISIS on the map, and then you also have this area, which is what we're going to get into now. And I'll have the timestamps, so those who are interested can just, focus on what's going on in terms of current events. You have in this northwestern area of Syria, Idlib, which was the province that was the holdout, and most of the rebels who were defeated throughout the country had fled and consolidated there. And it was only due to the fact that Turkey had stepped in multiple times in the last few years, and it even shot down a Russian jet at one point. They had basically prevented Assad from fully mopping up and ending the non-YPG elements of Syria that were resisting his rule and had tried to break away. They formed this sort of opposition parallel government. You had them sort of holding out in Idlib now, and the thing is with this area, these rebel groups, you had the more moderate Free Syrian Army, and then very quickly afterwards, at least especially in Idlib, you had a confluence of more Islamic jihadist groups. Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, al-Sham being Syria in Arabic, they are the rebranded version, or at least they claim to be disconnected from. There's a lot of room, especially considering that there's a lot of personnel that had been directly one-for-one carried over, such as the leader of Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, al-Julani, who yesterday, December 1st, I've been recording this later in the night, and it just became December 2nd over here on the east coast of the US, but al-Julani, at least according to unconfirmed reports, might have been just killed in an airstrike over in Idlib by the Russians as they're attempting to try to restore law and order, I guess, as they see it, and assist Assad in regaining the recently taken territories. We'll have to see, and it's not been confirmed yet, so just putting that out there, take it with a grain of salt. However, you have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is this rebranded version of the al-Nusra front, which was the official al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and al-Qaeda, anyone from America can tell you, they're the guys who are behind, or the main group who are behind 9/11, and not great people, as well as the fact that you had these other varying, they're not, this is the thing, it's not like they're all al-Nusra, there's a variety of people there, some probably more moderate than others, some who are jihadists but not affiliated with al-Qaeda. You have a whole mishmash of people, and they're under the umbrella of the Syrian Salvation Government, and then there's the Syrian National Army, which is backed by Turkey, and Turkey has been the one who, or Turkiye as they officially know themselves, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who have been basically keeping this area, Syria, preventing it from being reintegrated or conquered by Assad and his coalition. And that was the status quo up until very recently, and as I just had talked about in that article a bit ago, that had all just changed rapidly. And on Wednesday, which was only a few days ago, right before Thanksgiving, as people here in America were getting ready for time with their family, most of us at least. I had a good Thanksgiving, I hope you all did too, as we were all getting ready for the break and being able to enjoy time with our families. On the 27th of November 2024, which is only less than a week ago, you had a opportunity that looks like, just like in the, not exactly, but in the same way that Hamas, for their own reasons, which I'll get into in the segment I will do on them in October, on the situation ever since October 7th with Israel, you had a moment that looked like a window of opportunity, as the article mentioned, where for a multitude of variables, mainly Russia reallocating a lot of its air force and military assets to Ukraine from Syria, as they're fully enmeshed in that conflict, and with Trump coming into office and Biden recently announcing that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government would now be allowed to fire ATACMS and other long-range weapons that have been given to them by the West into Russia so that they can be able to better attack the supply depots and staging grounds that have been used by the Russians to shell cities like Kharkiv, among others, and give them more of a fighting chance in being able to retain the area of Kursk that they were able to regain during their surprise August offensive earlier this year. And again, this is such a big topic, and we can get into it in another one, but with the situation in Ukraine, and as well as the ongoing proxy, or I'd say, proxy conflict, or not, maybe outright conflict between Israel and Iran, because Iran has retaliated directly, but has still been heavily leaning on its proxy forces, such as the Houthis in Yemen, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon, and obviously to a lesser extent Hamas in Gaza, which has been not completely obliterated, but has definitely taken a huge number. Between those all being sort of enmeshed with dealing with Israel and the situation over there, and just the recent Lebanon ceasefire being talked about, and I think there's going to be one between Israel and Lebanon for a bit at least, and we'll have to see and go back to that in a little bit. Because of all those things, it looked like all of Assad's primary, the constituents of his coalition that were helping to prop him up and to, allow him to not just retain power, but make gains and advance and consolidate and regain all those population centers. They've been MIA, or it's not that they're MIA, but their presence has been significantly reduced, and it's been clear that that's the case because the rebels had been able to rapidly advance, and for something that took years to regain, Aleppo had quickly fallen with a tactical retreat of sorts being made by the Russian, Iranian, and Syrian contingents last few days from Aleppo. And now if you look at the live UAE map, the rebel forces have been basically doing a sort of blitzkrieg of sorts, and it looks like they're not at Hama yet, but they've taken Murak and Karabia, which are not too far away from Hama itself, and it looks like they're, as we're speaking, fighting for or contesting with the Syrian government control of the region. And it looks like, at least in that northwestern area where it was closer to Idlib and with the Turks backing them, it looks like the rebels were able to really take advantage of the element of surprise and the Syrian government's on the back foot. However, it looks like further south, closer to the areas that are within the more Assad-friendly heartland, or at least the areas where Assad has consolidated further, it looks like they've been able to stem the tide. And not to say that they're holding the line, we will have to see and check back in a bit, but it looks like it's not a complete router collapse, and it looks like right now both sides are digging in and getting ready for a protracted conflict, and the goal will be for Assad, with the help of Russia and Iran, once they can allocate the resources, to eventually retake Aleppo and the areas that were seized. And maybe this might even lead eventually, if Assad can gain the momentum and because I wouldn't count him out yet. I mean, people would count him out 10 years ago, and people were thinking about 10 years ago that he was finished, but we'll have to see. I mean, he has been pretty resourceful with leveraging his alliances, and although in some ways he's become a vassal, and unlike his father, Hafez has been far more reliant than I'm sure he'd like on external players such as Iran and Russia, he's still been able to hold on to power. And when it comes to the Idlib area, maybe if he can, maybe he'll have to try to take that out once and for all. As long as that remains out of his control, something like this will always be possible in the future, even if he's able to roll it back. But who's to say? Maybe with Turkey in particular, because we're going to have to look into this, and I want to get into now the Turkish dimension of this, because I think that that's something that, because a lot of people, there's been some who've been speculating, oh, this is the CIA, this is Mossad. Not to say that they're not involved when it comes to the various intrigues and conflicts abroad in terms of hybrid warfare, and I mean, more or less, I'm not saying every individual action, but when it comes to their overall modus operandi, I would support at least the CIA when it comes to its role in protecting America's national security interest. But when it comes to their influence in this particular case, when it comes to CIA and even Mossad, I'm not too sure about that to say. I think that the Turkish factor here is a far more prevalent variable to try to focus in on, keep in mind. And I think they're the ones who are really they're the ones here who are basically changing the state of play and have their foot on the gas pedal here and are in the driver's seat when it comes to renewing the sort of conflict here, turning it from a frozen one into reactivating it. And I think that beyond the fact that the Turkish government has prevented the rebels in this area from falling, not just Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, but all of them in general, and the fact that Erdogan has come out recently, he's been making comments about the situation in Palestine involving Israel, and I think cut off relations with Israel, at least officially. And he's also someone who's involved with Ukraine as well, not just contributing the Bayraktar 2 drones, which were very influential in the initial stages of the conflict, helping Ukraine prevent Russia from rolling them over, but you also have them closing the Dardanelles Straits that are, controlled by the fact that Turkey has Istanbul, or Constantinople as it used to be called. You have that sort of situation where they don't allow military, non-Black Sea native boats and ones with military purposes just to come in and out because it's technically in a state of war at the moment. You have Turkey also here in Syria. I also mentioned they're involved in Libya. They're making serious moves, and I think especially since they have that refugee population, they are looking here, and they've been talking about this for a long time coming, of creating a sort of deconfliction or demilitarized zone where they could then resend a lot of these refugees, because initially the Turks had brought in and they were accommodating to the refugees, but for a bit now, due to the already, less than ideal economic situation domestically in Turkey, the refugees have also exacerbated socioeconomic circumstances in Turkey with the native population there. And even though these are neighbors and Syria at one point was at least a former part of the Ottoman Empire, it seems like there's some love lost there, and a lot of the Turks are becoming increasingly inclined to want, at least especially in the areas where the Syrians the refugees have been predominantly located, they want them to go in one way or another. And obviously these refugees, most of them are probably not too fond of Assad, had left Syria due to the conflict and are probably more inclined, if not towards the rebels, rebels, at least not to be wanting to go back there. So that is one of the reasons I think why Turkey gave this the green light. Also, it's been a situation, I know that last year the Arab League, there was this clip of Zelensky and Assad being in the same room, which is funny because those who are paying attention know that Zelensky's backed by the US and Assad is backed by Russia. And it's funny because in some ways Syria and Ukraine, there's some parallels there, and even with Myanmar too, to a lesser extent, but especially with Syria and Ukraine, Assad is like our Zelensky, and Zelensky is like their Assad in a sense. I mean, I think Zelensky is overall a more benevolent figure, but nonetheless, I think that, divorcing my personal biases, you can see some parallels between the two, at least in terms of the role they play in their country in the broader sort of chessboard of geopolitics here. And when it comes to the Arab League, as I mentioned before, there was a period where the Syrians were booted out of there, and now you saw with Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and some other Gulf states in the Middle East, there has been this rapprochement period where Assad was being slowly welcomed back, at least, if not into the international community, at least into the broader Middle Eastern political community. And there has been those with grievances, like the US, like Washington in particular, with that, and some trepidation from others in the West. However, when it comes to that sort of situation, due to the fact that it seemed like, for at least up until now, the situation in Syria was more or less going to maintain status quo, and Assad was looking like he was here to stay, for better and for worse. And of course, if he's going to be the government based in Damascus, just out of a matter of real polity, sometimes you can't just, I mean, as much as I'm an idealist personally, you got to deal with the cards you dealt with. And if you're wanting to, especially with Syria's very important geostrategic place in the world, it's a blessing and a curse, being at the crossroads of the West Asia and being right, you know, situated in the Eastern Mediterranean, in an area historically that had been the prized province of various previous great empires, such as the Babylonians, and then you had the Syrians, Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then later the Arabs, etc., etc. This region is no stranger to conflict and great power competition, and unfortunately for the people of the region, they know this all too well. But when it comes to this particular area with Turkey, as beyond the fact that this was one of their former imperial stomping grounds, it's still an area that Turkey has considered of significant interest, being its neighbor and being its near abroad and kind of its own backyard from a political perspective. So the fate of what goes on with Syria beyond just Assad is something that Turkey will be invested in, not just for the foreseeable future, but for, I think, time immemorial, as long as we have politics as it is configured at the moment, at least more or less. And when it comes to the refugees, which I think are going to be resettled in this deconfliction zone if Erdogan gets his way, I mean, it's funny enough to mention that even the Turkish opposition that had lost the elections, the last situation that Erdogan had a year ago-ish, where he was potentially, I mean, at least from the West hope, was facing a potential ouster. Even the opposition groups, which were more Kemalist and secular nationalists, even they were looking to try to figure out a way to getting rid of these refugees from Syria. And as much as, you know, there's the human element, obviously, you don't want to demonize people who have nowhere else to go and who are fleeing from war, but when it comes to their, I guess, drain on the systems that they were being introduced to, when it comes to the countries that they were finding themselves in as displaced migrants, it looks like Turkey is like America and others. Eventually, you know, there's a level of hospitality and accommodation, but it can only go so far, especially when Turkey, much like the rest of the world, is going through their own economic headwinds. And when it comes to this situation with Turkey and these refugees, I think that that's one of the major reasons why, especially since it looked like Russia was looking to, I think, behind the scenes, convince Assad and Erdogan to resume a sort of detente, even though, because, I mean, Assad and Erdogan were relatively friendly prior to the Arab Spring, and then obviously when you had Erdogan, back when Obama was president, doing a joint communique in support of ousting Assad and basically siding with the rebels, obviously there had been fraught relations, and I think officially diplomatic ties between the Syrian Arab Republic and the Republic of Turkey, respectively, have been severed, and had ever since the conflict, you know, basically taking off, have been in that sort of situation. I'm sure there's back channels where they've been, you know, discussing a potential of re-establishing ties in the same way that Assad was re-invited back into the Arab League, and other Arab countries neighboring Syria have slowly but surely been extending a hand out in terms of being willing to try to engage in diplomatic activities. Kind of awkward, obviously, considering some of these countries were all too eager to see Assad out the door, but politics sometimes takes you in places and in directions that you never know until it happens, but sometimes into the least likely of circumstances. And sometimes when you think something's certain, it goes from that to the exact opposite. Fortunes are as quickly made as they are lost when it comes to the realm of politics, and in particular foreign relations. But I would say with Turkey and Erdogan, it looked like these talks behind the scenes were not really leading into anything fruitful. And even recently, I think in August, Assad had been slowly going from saying until Turkey fully withdraws its support from the rebel groups and its own military garrison in the northern reaches of the border area that was formerly between Syria and Turkey, that Turkey still is in. It went from no negotiations or detente until Turkey withdraws and ceases its support of what Assad considers terrorists and the Turks consider as rebels. I mean, you could be a rebel or a terrorist. I mean, I think depending on which group, these are not necessarily exclusive labels, and depending on which one you're talking about, such as Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, maybe they're both rebels and terrorists. But regardless of the semantics here, it looks like with Assad, he was not really Erdogan. He was not getting the sort of concessions that were inclining him to further take things to the next level and officially reestablish ties with Assad. I'm sure that Assad probably doesn't want millions of potentially anti-government refugees or the families of those coming back, regardless of whatever intricacies had not been sort of meshed out between the two. It seems like the situation was far from amicable, as Turkey looks like they're the ones who probably the most privy and maybe in some ways supporting this recent renewal of conflict where the rebels have just taken over Aleppo and are making their way down towards the city of Hama. And I mean, you see some of these rebels from the videos I've seen, and I'll link some of them below, saying that they'll take Damascus, Homs, Hama, etc. Not too sure about that, especially as I do think that despite what the article was saying, I think even though Iran, especially with Hezbollah after Lebanon being sort of weakened significantly, I don't think Putin will be with Russia and everything at stake, especially considering before the whole Ukraine situation, Syria was one of the major international theaters that the Russians were able to successfully use. So I think, I mean, listen, divorcing my own particular sentiments when it comes to the fact that I'm pro-America, I'm not in favor of the sort of world order Putin's envisioning, but divorcing my opinions when it comes to that in particular, what Putin was able to pull off when it comes to the public relations success of not just being able to save Assad, but also be able to project power, as Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has largely been seen as a shell and rump state, or a shell of its former self to an extent, and I think there's an element of truth to that. However, when it comes to its ability in the Middle East, I think it has been able to punch well above its weight, akin to how Alexius I Komnenos in Byzantium was able to, after the First Crusade, consolidate and punch above his weight. I mean, of course, it's not exactly a one-for-one, and for some obvious reasons, I'm sure Putin might not be exactly flattered by the analogy, considering what would happen after Alexios I Komnenos would pass, and the ultimate fate of his dynasty a couple of generations down the line. I mean, it had a good run for what it was worth, and was one of the more successful ones given the circumstances that the dynasty was faced with in Byzantium at the time. But for Russia in particular, I think that it's just good to sometimes, when it comes to modern circumstances, make sense of them through looking back at the past, especially considering that Putin, at least in particular, he is a man who, if not anything else, is a student of history with imperial aspirations to restore the glorious days of Tsarist Russia, or at least in his eyes, I think, because more than anything, I don't think that some who say that he wants to resurrect the Soviet Union are quite accurate. I think, if anything, despite being part of the KGB and being someone who lived in the days of the Soviet Union, he still, you know, as he famously said, considers to be, when it came to its collapse, the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, something you note of considering the broader sort of trends that we're seeing and Russia's role in the world. But at any rate, as long as he's being the ruler of Russia at least, and I'm sure his successors probably, if they're in the same sort of school of thought as him, probably have similar sentiments. But that aside, when it comes to Putin and his situation in Russia, I think that it's good to try to lay out some of the framework which I think will make sense of his actions both in the past in Syria, which I mentioned before, but also to try to see whether or not he'll be able to come through for Assad, and to what degree, even if he wanted to, can he actually, considering that his finite resources are mainly being allocated at the moment towards his quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine, which I think, given a couple of significant recent developments, including what's going on in Syria, are further complicating his goals of Tsarist resurrection and trying to make sure that Russia remains a preeminent power in the world, especially considering its loss of the former USSR and the fact that it was the leading Soviet republic in that sort of state at the time, which was a superpower competing with the United States, which is the whole basis for the Cold War of the 20th century. But let's get into those things at the moment when it comes to what I think would be mitigating for and against Assad when it comes to Putin, who was really a lifeline that had saved him when it seemed like all hope was lost. Two of the reasons in particular, I think, that would probably cause Putin to want to provide as much help as he can, despite his current disposition and the ongoing domestic situation beyond just Ukraine. At the moment, the ruble, which is the Russian currency, is at its weakest point against the dollar since 2022, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was launched. And that is something that is very interesting because I think it's going to cause a lot of domestic pessimism and a situation that is less than ideal, beyond the fact that there's that partial military mobilization. And that was one of the reasons why Putin enlisted the aid of not just getting artillery pieces, but actual personnel from Kim of North Korea. And that would include the 10,000 soldiers there, with the promise of 100,000 in total from the rotation of having to have his units rest and recover in between. And I think it's interesting to mention those numbers because Russia has had, at any given point, usually at most, I think, 5,000 soldiers in Syria at any given point, including the technicians that would be needed to handle the logistics, especially when it came to the air support campaign that really helped Assad turn the tide and reclaim those major population centers I mentioned before, which are now, Aleppo was just taken, and Hama looks like it's on its way to being besieged. And if the rebels are to be taken at their word, they're looking like they want to keep that momentum and maybe even try to take the whole thing. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, I know in Afghanistan, famously, the president of Afghanistan had been derided as the mayor of Kabul, given the fact that the Taliban had constantly had supremacy over the countryside and through their sort of guerrilla war in that region. And I think that with Assad, in the worst case scenario, because I think it was sort of the reverse. At one point, some were thinking that Idlib might be this sort of isolated pocket if the Turks were going to make sure, since they had that sort of armistice in 2021 that they negotiated between Russia and Assad that prevented that mopping up operation. Some were thinking that this could be a sort of Kosovo or sort of enclave that would be sort of separated from the rest of Syria proper under Assad. But now it looks like the tables, depending on where it goes, could completely turn, with maybe Assad becoming the mayor of Damascus at the end of the day, controlling and claiming to be the president of Syria and controlling the capital, but despite that, maybe losing control of the entire country if things get bad enough and the support he needs does not come his way and come his way fast. And that's something we're going to have to wait and see, because things are rapidly developing. And by the time I upload this, since I've updated the podcast, the initial part of it was recorded on December 1st and December 2nd, and this part of it is being recorded on the 3rd and 4th, just to highlight some of the changes, since things have really been evolving on the ground. I think that it's good to keep all this stuff in mind, especially since I've been editing this clip, and I wanted to make sure that everything here is up to speed, and I'll probably have to have some more follow-ups, forthcoming. That'll be something to look forward to, I guess, at any rate. But when it comes to Russia and its vested interest in Syria, because it's not just doing this out of the goodness of its heart. Keep in mind, ever since 1971, back during the days of Bashar's father, Hafez, and the Soviet Union that Putin had grown up in, they had established a naval base in Tartus, which provided Russia with a very strategic access point to the Mediterranean, particularly the Eastern Med, and that allowed it to have a war mortar port 365 days of the year. Because keep in mind, despite the fact that Russia geographically is the largest country by landmass, it ironically and sort of tragically, which I think has been its Achilles heel, has relatively limited access to the open seas due to the fact that in most cases, a lot of their key ports are frozen, especially up north, due to the winter. I mean, maybe climate change will change all that. However, if you look at the rest of the ports, the Pacific is one sort of situation which has its issues, but to mainly focus on its western side, which is in its European theater near its heartland or historic heartland, if you look at the fact that the Danish Straits have always been sort of a dicey area for Russia, but now ever since Sweden and Finland respectively have joined NATO, ever since their fears and the escalations in Ukraine had caused them in 2022 to apply and get into that sort of process, Russia now increasingly is surrounded and has its Baltic fleet, which is based in St. Petersburg, sort of at the mercy, and not completely, but sort of has, I mean, to say that they have unfettered access up there would be the exact opposite of the truth of the seas, and there's a lot of ways that NATO could effectively hem them in up there. And then also the fact that, and one of the reasons why the whole Ukraine conflict started back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, is that Russia's Black Sea fleet is stationed, or was, because a lot of it has taken a hit in the conflict that is going to be going on up there, was, and still is to an extent, at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. However, even given that with the Black Sea Fleet, whether, the state of it or not aside, it also was facing issues because of the fact that Turkey controls, as I mentioned before, access to the Bosphorus Straits, and that is something, again, that provides a roadblock to Russia having unfettered access to the open seas. So this Tartus naval base that Russia has had in one form or another, both it and the USSR, for over 50 years now, half a century, is something that I think that Russia is very much in the mind of wanting to retain, and it allows it to have a significant base of operation in its ability to project force, especially in a naval sense. Also to keep in mind is the fact that as of 2015, which this is a newer sort of addition to Russia's overseas military bases, they have Aminim, I think I might be butchering that though, over in Latakia, which is their air base that they had used to provide the sort of support that really, again, helped turn the tide during the Syrian conflict against Assad. I mean, those bombings that everybody talks about for better and for worse wouldn't have been possible from Russia if they did not have this air base. And that's something that actually is being threatened right now in some sense, because it's only 20 miles away from the most recently captured areas that the rebels have been able to take in their recent lightning offensive. We'll have to wait and see, but I think from a strategic point of view, if the rebels had the wherewithal, they probably would like to make it so that Russia couldn't be bombing them. And one of the reasons why they're not even allowing the civilians to leave Aleppo right now at mass is because of the fact that, in a way, unfortunately, they're sort of being used, much like what Hamas does, as human shields. And I think Israel has done that with Palestinian prisoners, just to be fair in that situation, as that whole thing is a whole mess down there. But, using human shields is pretty bad. I'm almost positive it's against the Geneva Convention, using civilians as shields in military operations. But, unfortunately, that phrase, all's fair in love and war, seems like it is at least de facto holding true, especially in this situation. And with the case in Aleppo right now, which had already been damaged significantly in the last battle that Assad's government had with the help of its coalition of Iran and Russia to retake the main centers of Syria, it looks like, again, that it's in the crosshairs. And I think that, the rebels being able to sort of put that air base out of action would probably be to their advantage. But we'll have to wait and see on that front. And I think both of those bases are going to be something that Russia, if it can, will try to preserve, and that would require them assisting Assad in propping up his government even further, which, again, it looks like right now things are up in the air. And I think that when it comes to that situation, especially when you think about the fact that recently Russia's envoy to the UN had accused Ukraine of helping the rebels, I think that's questionable. But, if they could in some way provide intelligence, considering that Russia had plenty of Syrian mercenaries at the onset of Ukraine being sent to help bolster their forces, obviously they wouldn't admit it, and same with what Russia would not admit. It's more shady tactics. I mean, if they could somehow do something to assist, maybe they gave information to Turkey who passed it on to them. I don't know, that's just speculation, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. And I think that, in all fairness to Ukraine, which is fighting for its very existence and sovereignty at the moment against Russia, it would be something that wouldn't even be necessarily unprovoked. But, you know what I mean? I guess, again, with the rebels and some of their more dubious motivations, especially the particular faction that was the successor to the al-Nusra front, there's a lot of, moral dubiousness here. And we can get into all that in another segment, but it's just something to keep in mind. It's a serious situation here, no pun intended. However, In the worst case scenario for both Putin and Assad, if Russia simply is overstretched and potentially can't allocate or is limited in terms of its aid that it can supply further, I think it is interesting to also consider the situation that might happen, as I alluded to before, with maybe Assad barely holding on, if anything, to just the capital and maybe its surrounding environment. If that would be one of the worst cases, if not a complete collapse and ousting of Assad, and maybe his flight from Syria, depending on if he whether he takes the Zelensky route, with that famous line of "I don't need ride, I need ammo." Well, we'll have to see. And the situation in Ukraine is far from finished as well, and we're yet to see even what goes on when it comes to Zelensky's ultimate fate. But that aside, I do think that considering that Russia has shedded its prior obligations in other theaters of geopolitical significance in the past, even recently, namely the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh with that former Republic of Artsakh, which was an Armenian enclave inside of Azerbaijan, which I mentioned a little bit beforehand. And I'll get into in a moment, because when it comes to Iran, I think that there's some relevance to that country and the situation that is facing them and what's restricting their capacity to fully help Assad, which in general was already something that Russia was filling in the vacuum for prior to everything going on right now, but it's something I think that should be factored in as well, because they have played a role that is relatively significant, maybe to a lesser extent than Russia's, but again, significant nonetheless. And when it came to Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an area that was under dispute ever since the 90s following the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of the fact that Azerbaijan and Armenia respectively were, not by their own personal choice, but by the coercion of the Soviet Union, which during its heyday had the ability to do so, just like with the Baltic states. They had annexed both of those countries, and they were part of the USSR, with Russia being the main Soviet republic, obviously, and Moscow having most of the political power when it came to arranging things. And under Stalin, I think in particular, and then I think some of his successors, there was arrangements that were made when it came to that conflict that sort of made it inevitable if, in the event that the Soviet Union collapsed, when it came to that situation afterwards, you saw the outbreak of hostilities. Azerbaijan over time was able to turn the tide and use its wealth that it had accrued from its oil exports and developing its economy to build up its military, which we saw. And Russia was formerly one of the main peacekeeping forces that was sort of the man in the middle between Azerbaijan and Armenia, as the sort of big brother and former suzerain of both of those countries, and in that region of the Caucasus in general, having supremacy ever since it claimed so after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the sort of defeat of Iran in that area in centuries past when they had their own imperial presence there. But that aside, Russia, when it came to its commitments in Nagorno-Karabakh, it had, due to the situation in Ukraine that was preoccupying it, had not been able to send what it probably could have done if it had the resources and the situation in Ukraine wasn't developing in the way that it was. And that basically led to Azerbaijan fully going in and basically settling that particular part of the dispute they have with Armenia, leading to Azerbaijan crushing the Republic of Artsakh and effectively setting the path towards ethnically cleansing. Not completely genociding, but a lot of those residents there fled, achieving a fait accompli when it comes to their long-standing dispute with that region. And I think that is relevant because Russia's ongoing situation in Ukraine, I think if it was between Ukraine and Syria, if they had to choose, of course they're going to choose Ukraine, because like Leon Trotsky and others had stated, without Ukraine, Russia ceases really to be an empire. And I think that is something that is still true and is the main impetus for why Ukraine is that major theater of geopolitical struggle and why Russia has gone all in on that. But we're going to have to wait and see again when it comes to that. And I think Russia's role again is going to cast a huge shadow. And whether or not it will be able to do what it can to prop up Assad is again a question that we will see the answer to in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Maybe even in a shorter interval than the latter parts of what I just said. Your guess is as good as mine. But I do think right now, if given the current situation and how fast the rebels can advance as they're looking like they're setting up a siege at Hama, we might know very soon, and this might really be putting Assad on the ropes. Who knows? I mean, he could really, again, he's been very wily and leveraging those relationships with Russia and Iran in the past. I think he might be able to see this through. Again, we'll have to wait and see. But to mention Iran again very quickly, because I wanted to get into because this situation with them, because it's something that I think we should highlight. It's a little bit, again, of a more diminished status for multiple reasons. They had the ceasefire with Lebanon brokered between Hezbollah, which I think was a main reason why the Syrian rebels took this opportunity now before Hezbollah could reorganize and reallocate forces, because I think just like with Russia, they had left a skeleton crew in the place of what they were using to help back Assad and his security forces, in contrast to what they were probably sending at the height during the time when Assad was really making gains back between 2015, 2016 to 2019-ish, when they were able to retake all those major population centers I mentioned before. However, I think with that ceasefire situation, which again, I mean, it's worth its own segment, which looks like there's some issues with just that and whether or not that in southern Lebanon will hold. I think that was due to the fact that, again, that Hezbollah has been largely decimated. Its leadership, including its famous leader Hassan Nasrallah, had been killed by Israel in a successful, attempt of basically liquidating their leadership. And with those pager attacks that they were able to do, morally dubious as they were also able to significant dent in the overall personnel and fighting power of Hezbollah, on top of the fact that they've been going through this sort of renewal of hostilities, trying to create a sort of buffer zone and reach the Litani River. There's a ceasefire now, and it'll be questionable. I think that it's far from finished over there. And when it came to the situation, I think with Iran, considering Hezbollah's role as their sort of foreign legion and main foreign proxy. I mean, they do have the Houthis in Yemen and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, among others, but Hezbollah really was the crown jewel in what was Iran's axis of resistance outside of its own direct military forces, such as the IRGC and its own army. But when it came to Hezbollah now, I think that, which again was a major contingent of assistance for Assad, definitely has taken a hit. And I think that that's also going to mitigate against Assad, and is one of the reasons why the vacuum increasingly for Assad's foreign backing has been filled up by Russia, which again, I just talked about them, between Russia and Iran, which again, they're not even, they've had their own issues in the past when it came to their own conflicts and conflicting imperial visions. They're allies of convenience in a similar sense as Russia and China. What brings them together is less mutual sense of love and altruism for themselves, but more a mutual sort of disdain and opposition to those such as, formerly Britain and now including America and the West more broadly speaking. But we can get into, again, that type of more macro geopolitical stuff between the great powers in another segment. I think we want to, wrap this up relatively soon before, by the time I'm done, another news cycle worth of events come up and make this further irrelevant. Well, you're appreciating my insight nonetheless. Anyways, when it comes to the situation in Iran, I think another big thing, just to put this into, the sort of perspective I think that would allow us to have the closest approximation to what we're dealing with in terms of the practical limitations, as well as the possibility for Assad to be able to grab victory out of the jaws of what looks like a potential defeat, when it looked like it was the other way around not too long ago, is the fact that Iran, ever since May of 2024, when President Raisi had passed in a helicopter crash coming back from Azerbaijan, ironically enough, they've had now a new president ever since the elections, with Pezeshkian being the new president, who's a more moderate-leaning figure similar to Rouhani in the past, who was a more moderate figure that had helped under the Obama administration broker the Iran deal, or the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that allowed the sort of nuclear deal that would be in place, that was canceled under Trump, but had allowed oversight and a limiting of what Iran's nuclear capacity would be. That sort of thing, I think, might also, especially with the transition of the Biden administration to the incoming Trump one in less than 2 months from now, that could be something that also could give Iran pause. And especially, even though that the Supreme Leader Khamenei, who is actually half Azeri, just a random fun fact, since we talked about Azerbaijan before, considering also the fact that Azerbaijan, beyond it being a country, it also has a significant minority population in Iran itself, in its northern border area with Azerbaijan in the Caucasus region, which is one of those concerns it's had, among others, when it comes to the various ethnic groups besides the Persians themselves, who might potentially, have separatist aspirations in the future, along with the Kurds. We'll have to wait and see on that, and, who knows what the future will hold on that. But when it comes to Khamenei, who, again, is, I think, relatively skeptical and probably doesn't want to engage in anything like the JCPOA, and, again, for his own reasons, I think from their perspective, they're justified. If you're a pro-Iranian person from Iran, he's probably not as keen on it, but Pezeshkian, I think, would be looking to still probably try to do some sort of détente with the U.S. under Trump, and I think that's something, who knows what will happen with that. I don't know if that's that likely, but I think, again, they might, hope springs eternal, and they might try to hold out for something along those lines. All those things together factored in, I think, is leaving Assad looking like he is on the ropes, and I think that the momentum can change, especially if a counteroffensive is successful. But considering that a couple of days ago there was questions, Assad was MIA, and the presidential palace he has, not in Damascus, the main one, but one of the other ones he has, the second, I guess, most important one, since Aleppo was a preeminent city in Syria before the whole civil war sort of thing took place prior to 2011. There were rebels that were recording themselves breaking into and just chilling out in Assad's palace in Aleppo, which, on top of just the fact that him and his family, there were questions of whether or not they were in Moscow and whether or not he would either go the Zelensky route of, his famous give me not a ride but give me ammo, or would he do the opposite of that and sort of go the route of the former leaders of South Vietnam or Afghanistan that were backed by US in that situation, but went between Nguyen Van Thu or Ashraf Ghani. I almost forgot his name, considering that, again, he was someone who was referred to as the mayor of Kabul, among others. He had fled right before the Taliban retook Afghanistan back in 2021. We'll have to see with Assad, though, what will happen with him. I think that, again, he is largely reliant on outside assistance and those external forces that helped them in the past. There are, again, significant factors that are mitigating against them being able to provide that same level of support, or it leaves something comparable in the time frame that he would probably need in order to make the difference here. But again, we'll have to wait and see on that. And considering the rapidly evolving nature of events on the ground in Syria, this was supposed to be actually just about the fall of Aleppo and its immediate aftermath, as well as the major players and what their relationship is going to be with Syria going forward from a geopolitical point of view. However, in between the time I initially started recording this and right now, with morning of December 5th, my bad again for not being able to get this out sooner, but things have rapidly been occurring at a breakneck pace. And now there's the fall of Hama, which I'm going to do a separate standalone podcast and include other things I missed a little bit, since I want to talk more about the US's role. I've done it in the past, but I haven't in this one, as well as the dynamics with Israel, the Gulf states, and whether or not Assad might be literally teetering on the brink of a collapse akin to what had occurred with Ashraf Ghani and the Afghan government that had been ousted by the Taliban in 2021, shortly after the US had withdrawn. And in a similar sense, I think there's other parallels, which I'll get into in the upcoming segment, with the withdrawal of Russia from Tartus, its naval assets they had announced, as well as its air force in wherever the skeleton crew it has, I guess, in Latakia, and the fact that it's sort of similar to that of what occurred with the US at Bagram in Afghanistan, and that whole situation there. Who knows whether Assad will be able to turn the tide, whether he'll become the de facto mayor of Damascus. We'll have to see, and I definitely will have very soon, after I rest a little bit, a follow-up, and we'll cover, by that point, maybe even, who knows, maybe the rebels will be, God forbid, in Damascus already, or at, besieging Homs. We'll have to see, and I'll definitely make sure I try to get some shut-eye and get back to you all as soon as possible. But yeah, I think that this will tie a bow on things for now. Hopefully you enjoyed everything, and at least the coverage I did a little bit ago is still within the last week, but it'll definitely require, I've already come to the conclusion, a immediate follow-up. But that's something you can all look forward to. And thanks again for tuning in. This has been Tom for Get Nuanced with TJC. Make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe on YouTube, click the bell notification icon. If you're tuning into this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever platform that you tune into podcast on, make sure to subscribe on there. Check out, hint, hint, this is something I haven't announced yet, but we'll have a standalone for the Substack newsletter, which will also include a place where you can tune into the podcast on. And yeah, check out the resources I referenced before, linked below, as well as the social media we're on, which are all together the best means of connecting with either the show or myself, if you so choose to do so. And I'd love to hear what you all think. I would take any feedback, positive or negative, and constructively incorporate it when I can into future content programming. But at any rate, much appreciated for you all tuning in, and I'll catch you all in the next segment I make again really, really soon. In the meantime, stay safe and peace out.